Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Susan Wedge, the managing partner for the U.S. public and federal market at IBM Consulting, and Mark Johnson, the vice president of technology for the U.S. federal market at IBM. Good to have you both with us.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
And our topic is artificial intelligence. That's the word on every Fed's lips. It's even bigger than cloud computing these days. A very, very important topic. And Mark, we'll start with you. IBM actually has a track record of artificial intelligence in federal applications. Give us a sense of how you develop them. How does it work?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question because we have been doing this for many years and starting out in things like playing chess and playing Jeopardy, which many people are familiar with, but then transitioning into federal use cases. A lot around health, a lot around finding ways to improve the business of government. And so as we develop these, that's important to us to think about. It's not just, can I generate some new text that responds to your question in a pithy and interesting way, but are we actually solving a problem? And can we point back to how we've solved that and what information was used to make the answers that we give back?
Yeah, so there's some visibility that people have into how it is you developed the algorithm to do something.
Absolutely. That's what we call trustworthiness, right? To be able to point back to how the answer was developed, which is often hard for a lot of AI solutions. And then what data was involved in creating that answer.
So the black box becomes made of clear lucite.
Maybe not completely clear lucite, but certainly a lot more traceable than a lot of solutions that are out there.
Okay, Susan, some examples.
Yeah, we're doing AI across, as Mark said, solving real government problems across the federal government. And I know we've talked in previous segments, Tom, about how we're using it to get benefits out to veterans more quickly. We're also doing things for the IRS to expedite paper processing of tax returns, to be able to get tax refunds to citizens more quickly. In the defense space, we're using it in the Navy to help with some supply chain challenges that they're facing. So really being able to apply the technology in a transparent and trustworthy way to solve a real government problem.
Yeah, that IRS one's really interesting because even though paper returns are probably less than 10% of total returns, it's something like 90% of the work for the employees. Sounds like a really good example of that augmentation idea. Can you tell us more about how it's working?
Yeah, exactly. It's really about how do you leverage technology to augment the human and produce more effective and efficient results, right, at a lower cost to serve the citizen. So being able to do some of the manual labor in an automated fashion so that the human is spending their time on the higher value activities and being able to do that in a more rewarding way and a more impactful way.
But there's more to it than simply scanning paper and character recognition. There's an element of the intelligence there that helps people decide what to do about a certain thing.
Exactly, and I think that's the big shift you're seeing now from the AI we've had in production use cases across the government, and now we're talking about generative AI. AI has really been about pattern recognition and training those models to recognize patterns, whereas you shift to generative AI, it's actually about pattern creation or creating content, and that content can be in a number of different ways. So that's really the shift we're seeing with the big push around generative AI is that content creation component.
And in the Navy supply chain area, of course, that opens up a lot of questions. Supply chain, just market research, for example. Agencies aren't really good at that, and it seems like there's a good place for AI to help them with market research to be competitive and proper in how they do procurements. But what are some of the ways AI is playing in there?
It's a couple different cases that we've seen across both our government and commercial customers. There's certainly procurement-related use cases, and then augmenting humans throughout the supply chain processes to make sure that the right goods, materials get to the right places at the right time and in that transparent way.
Yeah, it's especially important now when we have carriers deployed all over the world. It's a very real issue. These are not academic problems that agencies are trying to solve, are they?
Exactly.
And I wanted to get more from you about that whole idea of the generative, which at first seemed, well, that's nothing for government. That's only for playing around or whatever people do. Turns out government is nosing around generative a lot. Maybe tell us more about fundamentally how it differs from traditional AI. You began on that with the pattern recognition idea.
Yeah, so absolutely. So when you think about generative AI, it really is about creating the content, right? So not just recognizing patterns, but based on a number of data models and foundation models, being able to create content. That could be images, that could be words, and being able to generate or create that content. We're seeing a number of different use cases across our client base. So for example, if you think in the government space, many of our government customers have a very outdated IT applications, right? Thinking on legacy COBOL code. And what if you could use generative AI technology to actually convert that COBOL code to more modern languages? Right, you no longer, you can do a code conversion where a real developer can look at the code that's created, validate that code, and accept that code. So we're seeing really high acceptance rates when we've done code conversion using generative AI, in the 80+% acceptance rates. So you think about applying that to a legacy government application environment, and being able to get to more modern technologies that enable them to take advantage of, some of the other technologies out there.
Yeah, talk about a rich target environment with legacy code in the public sector. And what about the idea of using generative maybe in rulemaking or in ways of summarizing what are these 10,000 comments we got all about, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we're absolutely seeing it. So looking at it in sorting through large amounts of data and making sense of that data. And that can be both structured data as well as unstructured data. And being able to both train the models to recognize patterns, but then to create new content based on what's learned. So being able to span that spectrum from one end to the other. The other area to offer up is in the citizen experience, right? So being able to change how citizens interact with government is another area that we've seen a lot of interest.
Okay, and what are the data implications there, Mark? Because I know IBM's experience is in making sure that all of the language that goes into a model comes from a given domain, where words may have a different meaning than they do in a different domain. The word I've always heard is pike. Well, in medieval warfare, pike means one thing. In public road work, pike means something entirely different. And in the world of fishing and commerce, it means something, a third thing. So maybe comment on ensuring that your large language models have the language you really want and not what you don't want.
I think that's an important point now that people are starting to realize. It's not just about the volume of data you can bring in, but it's the provenance of that data. Where is it coming from? What domain does it exist in? Like you used the example of Pike. We have in IBM pulled together a large data set of curated data. So back to the trustworthiness, it's free of any intellectual property concerns, but we also then have used that to train the models that can be augmented with domain-specific information. So for a particular agency or a particular use case, they can feed in the information that tells it exactly what kind of questions are going to be posed and where they should get the answers from to make sure that they are answering about a medieval weapon instead of a fish.
Right, sure. So this implies then that to use artificial intelligence effectively takes some real planning and a little bit of know-how. You can't treat it as if it's magic and all my problems are solved.
Absolutely, and that's something we are working with a legislative body right now on doing a pilot to look at the tens to hundreds of thousands of pages of legislation and helping either citizens or lawmakers themselves realize what's in that as they think about potentially new laws or new regulations they're going to bring out. How does that affect what exists today? And it actually summarizes it. So we've had the use cases for a while. Susan talked about IRS being able to help citizens go in and find answers to questions. That's more the traditional, just matching up, here's the answer. But now we're able to say, if we change something, how would that affect all the existing laws now? That's more of a retrieval augmented generation, we call it, or RAG solution.
Sure, yeah, so because legislation is so hard to read as it is, and they handcraft it by what paragraph has to be changed by the insertion of what word and this kind of thing. So that could really augment legislative staffs. Absolutely. And probably, I guess, help transparency to the public too, that has to live by the laws that their lawmakers craft for them. Fair to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so Susan, the implication there is there's a real human capital and real training issue that I imagine IBM has to deal with so that you get success in working with the clients and the federal agencies and state and local agencies to have the outcomes they hope for.
Absolutely. I think it's about making sure we're making investments internally. We've stood up a center of excellence with north of 1,000 dedicated consultants focused on being able to be deployed around the world, and then augmenting that with our industry-specific knowledge or market-specific knowledge in each of the geographies and markets that we serve. So really having that core expertise that's augmented. But then also partnering with clients to make sure they understand both the benefits and the risks of using technology like generative AI, and helping them plan for not just, as you said earlier, you don't just do it and leave it alone. It's a continuous process and a continuous part of how work gets done in the future.
Yeah, you really have to have stewardship of the life cycle of that application because of the drift issues and the possibility of wrong data being ingested, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
All right, so anything else on human capital? Because we're going to take a break in a minute here, but I wanted to make sure we cover that because that seems to be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I think it's about human capital from our client's perspective. It's about how do you make that human capital, right? With population rates going down, how do you make the workers that we have as effective and as efficient as they can be, leveraging the technology? So I think that's the key.
On that note, we will take a short break. My guests today are Susan Wedge. She's managing partner for the U.S. public and federal market at IBM Consulting. And Mark Johnson is the vice president of technology for the U.S. federal market at IBM. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. This discussion is reimagining how federal agencies get work done. Welcome to AI's new inflection point, sponsored by IBM here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to our discussion, reimagining how federal agencies get work done. Welcome to AI's new inflection point, sponsored by IBM here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Susan Wedge. She's managing partner for the U.S. public and federal market at IBM Consulting. And Mark Johnson is the vice president of technology for the U.S. federal market at IBM. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And AI really seems, Mark, to bring us to the edge, or maybe we're over the edge now and falling into a technology disruption era, almost the same way that, virtual computing changed mainframes and changed everything forever. What is different, do you think, about this inflection that we're in? I mean, what's going on?
I think right now we're talking about how AI influences operations and the business of government and federal agencies. In the past, you talked about virtualization or cloud. Those were very much in the IT center, in the IT domain, and operations took advantage of it, and the business was able to lower costs or increase effectiveness. But now they are directly interacting with systems, whether it's government workers themselves, whether it's the citizens. They're engaged with AI actively, dynamically, and creating new things that we had, frankly, quite never thought of. And as we look at those foundation models and change those, I think we've just barely begun to scratch the surface of the revolution that's going to happen now.
Yeah, you mentioned people are now directly interacting with systems. What's going on exactly? I mean, people have been accessing goods and services online. What's different about, how does AI change that?
I think what's different now is that before, everything was programmed and coded specifically such that the agencies that wrote the requirements and defined what was going to happen could draw a line directly to the output that is going to come. Whereas now it can be much harder sometimes depending on the tools that they're using. And so that's what they're kind of trying to wrap their minds around, is how do we use AI in a way that adds value to us, but also is traceable and trackable and is open, to our citizens to be able to use, but securely and safely so that we don't betray any information that we're not supposed to.
It seems like in this revolutionary era, if we want to call it that, one of the fundamental questions is what remains at the discretion of the human being and what remains for the discretion of the machine. In the military context, fire decisions, pulling a trigger, to a person in the military, they'll say that is always going to be a human decision. But maybe it's a little fuzzier in other domains?
I don't think so. IBM's position is that AI is for augmenting human decisions and human intelligence. There's some fear sometimes out there that AI is coming for people's jobs, and I don't believe that's the case. I believe the person that knows how to use AI better is coming to take the job. And that's why we want to help our federal agencies and the citizens that they support to know how to use that AI effectively, but ultimately always retain the decision making at their level.
Because I'm thinking in the world of adjudication, and there are many, many federal agencies that have some adjudicatory function. Sometimes facts are cut and dried. Sometimes you have to have an administrative judge or an administrative law judge make a decision in those contexts. Is there a way to automate the cut and dried, but yet have that decision auditable, which is augmentation, but also taking a little bit of the work off a human?
Absolutely, and that's some of the summary that Susan was talking about before of ways to consolidate a vast amount of information into a very easy to read summary, which helps when it's very clear, cut and dried. The decision is made very quickly. If it is a little bit harder, then the system will tell the person that, because again, we have traceability within the system, and that's important to us, that governance level, so that people can decide, go back and look maybe at the source information and say, yeah, this does make sense. It is properly interpreted by the AI.
Right, and that gets into some subtleties where you still need the pattern recognition, but sometimes people make mistakes in submitting forms, filling out forms online or on paper, and it's very costly and time-consuming to go through all that. So that's a good example of where AI could help speed up and augment in that sense.
Absolutely, and you think of it as, when you were talking about the decision maker, what are the mundane tasks or the sorting through a lot of information quickly in order to be able to summarize that information for a decision maker. So really being able to take away the lower value, more time consuming work.
And I wanted to get back to the issue of data, because without good data, which can be big data, sometimes it's simply the right data, I think as we talked about the last time, there are questions agencies need to confront with respect to data provenance, ownership, and governance. You hear that word a lot. What are some of those issues, Susan?
I think you hit on the top three, right? And it really comes down to something Mark had said earlier, which is the transparency, right? Being able to understand what data is being used, how that data is being used, what's the source or provenance of that data, so that you how was the data trained if you're looking at some of the larger language models. So being able to understand that context, I think gives confidence to the use of that data as you execute your mission as a federal agency.
And are there also instances where the richer the data or the more varied the data, the better the AI can come up with what it is that you want as an output, which gets into the issue of data sharing and data ownership, and sometimes that can be a tough cultural shoal to navigate?
Absolutely. I think that's true across both large commercial organizations and governments, being able to get a broad or vast data set so that you can drive the best results.
And what about the issues of varying data types? If you're training a large language model and you throw every medical magazine of the past 25 years in there, well, it's still, German, French, English, Hebrew, whatever the case might be. It's language. But in real life applications outside of that, you could have PDFs, you could have videos. How is the state of AI able to take in varying data types?
We're very good at doing that right now, turning it into text and being able to parse it into the chunks necessary to produce some sort of output. I think the bigger question is, do you want all that data? And is it really adding value? And I think the industry has come around to saying, maybe not. When we actually curate the data a little better, we can get better results, even just straight using the smaller data sets that we have. Then we add it to our domain-specific information we talked about before, and now we're really getting what we want instead of just trying to ingest the entire internet, which of course then can lead to questions about the accuracy of it, hate information or additional bias that we talked about. So this is where IBM has created the role of a chief privacy officer, and she is very instrumental in helping us overall decide how we are going to implement our data sets and our AI solutions so that we're sure that we're providing information that is relatively free of bias as much as we can and is controlling any drift that's in that data as well.
And the privacy, I guess, is something you're sensitive to, having a big footprint in the health AI area, because you often need to combine many sources of data in health to understand a phenomenon or a trend, but it also comes with PII mixed in there too.
Correct. It's tough to, or it is easier to de-identify data sometimes when you have a large data set like that, especially, as you were saying, bringing it in from different areas. If we are able to de-identify data, that's a huge problem, right? And we want to make sure that we don't run into that. So we have governance tools that allows operators to look at that and decide, yes, we are going to include this data set, it is safe to do so, and here's how we're going to do that.
In fact, de-identifying, that's a whole art and science by itself, which is a kind of a moving target too. Maybe for another day we can talk about that one. But Susan, agencies come to this in the same way they came to cloud and to other earlier technologies. The first question is, how do I start? What do I do first? So what do you find as a best practice for the team and for approaching where you can get some results reasonably fast and without spending too much money?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. I think the first thing is to focus on the business problems, as Mark alluded to earlier, right? Being able to focus on what's the new outcome or the new experience that you want to drive from the application of that technology, and working backwards from that outcome or that experience that you've defined, being able to work backwards from there in order to be able to then apply the technology in a meaningful way. We've seen lots of clients get started with proofs of concept or proofs of technology, and starting small, operating on premise with limited data sets, being able to understand the technology so that they can help think through what does that future look like, right? So being able to co-create with our clients of we know you need a new outcome or new experience, but helping them imagine what that looks like by doing a proof of technology or proof of concept.
And probably for the clients, their best course is to ask, almost like the inverted pyramid, ask the people on the line, the adjudicators that we talked about, the fire control officers, those types of people, what it is they need, what are their big issues, and then migrate that up to the IT and governance and data people.
And one of the other things that we're seeing as helpful, right, and this is the benefit of being part of a global organization that operates across industries or across markets, is the use case sharing, right? So what are the lessons learned from across multiple industries? I often think of the federal government as a microcosm of most other industries, right? We operate hospitals, we run banks, we provide loans. So being able to look at what's being done in the commercial sectors and apply those lessons learned into the federal government too, which has also been beneficial.
Sure, and quickly, Mark, when you talk to your colleagues on the commercial side, who's ahead in this, industry or government, do you think?
That's a great question. It depends on what part of that. I think in the getting to real practical use cases, federal government in many cases is actually leading. I think industry is kind of standing back a little bit, and there's pockets that are really moving, but government's got a great opportunity here.
All right, good place to end our discussion. Thanks so much for some great insight. Our guests today have been Susan Wedge, she's managing partner for the U.S. public and federal market at IBM Consulting, and Mark Johnson, the vice president of technology for the U.S. federal market at IBM. And I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search IBM.